Having efficiently decimated all armies in his path, ruling conquered territory justly and efficiently, and treating conquered subjects with magnanimous mercy, Theodoric may have marked the peak of Gothic and Germanic dominance of the region. Dominance which would face an unexpected surprise attack, enabled in large part, it would seem, by that very lack of cunning and guile so often mentioned in their descriptions. A trait that acts as a great strength in homogeneous environments, creating high-trust atmospheres in which justice and the nobler instincts can flourish, can act as an equally great disadvantage in instances in which peoples and cultures mix indiscriminately and begin to act in their own tribal interests, often covertly. The Goths were to commit the civilization-destroying blunder of the trusting assumption that others were wired similarly to themselves, or held to the same standards and possessed a similar worldview. And in some cases, they made the mistake of attempting to artificially impose this worldview, believing they might change the inner nature of foreign peoples by example or through compulsion. It's an unfortunate historical reality that the unethical and amoral man is nowhere more powerful and efficient than within a virtuous and just society, while those around him restrain their vices and through strength and discipline keep their baser nature in subservient check. He has no such qualms, and thus his playbook is vastly larger, with virtually nothing being off limits, meaning even the most mediocre of men might succeed wildly within an overtly noble state. The fall of the Goths was to prove this point with stark clarity. In the final period of Theodoric's life, he began to suspect treachery and treason from several parties closest to him, and in the period afterward, in his last 3 years, many accounts speak of such a sudden and marked decline of physical and mental health that some suspected foul play, with several voicing openly that he'd been slowly poisoned. Far more mysterious foul play was to follow, including the mysterious death of Theodoric's daughter, Amalasuntha, at the age of 40, paired with an inflaming of tensions between Catholic and Arian factions, and thus a turning inward of energies within the empire, as infighting began in earnest. There's a line in the historian Procopius's explosive work, The Secret History, that struck me. Speaking of the deeply corrupt Justinian and his abomination of a wife, Theodora, and how they'd begun to consciously employ a tactic to more efficiently control their Eastern Roman Empire and surrounding regions and peoples, namely the divide and conquer method of creating two warring camps, in their case a blue and green faction. They each pretended to back a different faction and made a public show about caring for their success, which caused the people to believe that both sides were always represented, and allowed Justinian and Theodora to play manipulative games similar to those in our modern two-party system. This is one of the many fascinating narratives from the work, which I hope to give more attention to in a later video. But I mention this here to illustrate a new phenomenon of deceptive politics and artifice that began to dominate in this age. At this stage in history, we began to see the first battles between entirely Gothic and entirely non-Gothic armies, conflicts that act as a lasting testament against the absurdity of the Roman supremacy mythos, at least as far as late Rome is concerned. A recurring theme one can't help but notice with regards to the Germanic people, from the age of the Scythians to the age of the Vikings, is that if you wanted to beat their armies, you had to use their own armies. In other words, to find some means of carefully playing them off against one another, or making use of rogue mercenaries. When united, they simply didn't lose, and this is hardly an overstatement or exaggeration. There are very few exceptions here throughout the historical record. To cite one of the countless examples of this, the historian Isidore of Seville tells us of a later ruler named Swinthilla, who, quote, launched an expedition against the Basques who had invaded the province of Tarraconensis. There the mountain peoples were struck with such terror at his coming that they immediately threw down their weapons and freed their hands for prayer, submitting their necks to him as suppliants and giving him hostages, as if aware of his rightful jurisdiction. They built the city of Oligaicus for the Goths with their own taxes and labor, promising to be obedient to Swinthilla's rule and dominion, and to carry out whatever they were ordered to do." End quote. But the foremost foe of the Goths, of course, were the now angry and embittered remnants of Rome. Justinian, mentioned a moment ago as a deeply suspect character, began to launch aggressive attempts to stamp out Gothic supremacy. He was met by a brick wall, a man named Totila, another truly exceptional figure, virtually unknown to history, perhaps in part because he's such a profound testament to the merit and noble nature of the Goths. Cowardice and blundering had caused an initial surprise attack to fail, so the Roman forces had to meet Totila's army in the open. As Bradley states, quote, "Although the Goths had only 5,000 men, while the Romans had 12,000, Totila was victorious. The imperial army was completely dispersed, with a great loss in both slain and in prisoners." Another battle in the valley of Musilla had a similar ending, and Totila led his army into the south, capturing one city after another, and making the farmers pay into his treasury both the rents due to their landlords and the taxes that were due to the emperor. In other respects, however, he treated the people with so much kindness that he won a great deal of goodwill from those who had suffered from the lawless behavior of the Roman armies. End quote. Justinian then sent a considerable land and sea fleet, certain this would be enough to do the trick. Quote, "But its commanders were no match for the genius of Totila. Their fleet was defeated, and the most important leader of the expedition, Demetrius, was paraded in front of the walls with a halter around his neck, and made to harangue the garrison and its citizens in order to persuade them to surrender. The Gothic king himself also made a speech to the besieged, promising that if they would yield, neither soldier nor citizen should be any the worse for their submission. The temptation was strong, for the defenders were hard-pressed by famine and disease, but the garrison was unwilling to seem false to their sovereign, and begged that 30 days' truce might be allowed them. If no help came from the emperor within that time, they promised to surrender. Totila astonished the messengers by his reply. "By all means," he said, "I grant you 3 months' delay if you should choose to take it." And he undertook to make no attempt to storm the city during that time. He knew that the defenders would find it hard to struggle with the famine for even 1 month longer. Totila's calm confidence made them feel that the hope of succor was vain indeed, and a few days afterwards, the gates were opened. As soon as Totila entered the city, he saw from the appearance of the inhabitants that they had suffered terribly from famine. He had had, like Procopius, the opportunity of observing the effects of hunger on the human frame, and he knew that if those who were enfeebled by long privation were at once freely supplied with food, they were likely to be killed by plenty. With a thoughtful kindness, which, as Procopius says, could neither have been expected from an enemy nor a barbarian, he ordered that every person in the city should receive a daily ration of food, at first very small, but gradually increased until the danger had ceased to exist. Then, and not before, he allowed the gates to be thrown open, and proclaimed that the inhabitants were free to go or to remain as they chose. The Roman commander, Cronin, and most of his soldiers were placed on board ships, and informed that they were at liberty to sail to any port they preferred. They were ashamed to go to Constantinople, and tried to make for Rome. The wind, however, was contrary, and they were obliged to remain at Naples. Naturally, they felt very uneasy, for they thought that after Totila had given them one fair chance of escape, he would now consider himself entitled to treat them as prisoners. But the barbarians' generosity again surpassed expectation. Sending for Conan, he assured him that he and his companions might consider themselves as among friends, that until it was possible for them to sail, the Gothic markets were open to them, and that he would do everything he could to ensure their comfort. As, however, the wind continued unfavorable, Totila at length recommended them to make the journey by land, and actually provided them with beasts of burden, money for traveling expenses, and a Gothic escort. He did all this, though he knew that Conan and his men were going to increase the garrison of the city which it was his intention shortly to lay siege. Certainly he had given his kingly word that the soldiers should be allowed to march away whither they pleased. But it is seldom that any conqueror has observed a capitulation in this splendid fashion, either before or since. Even more rigorously than Belisarius himself, Totila repressed all acts of outrage on the part of the army. No matter who was the offender, the penalty was death. One officer of high rank, and very popular among his comrades, had committed a crime of this kind and had been placed under arrest. The chiefs of the army employed Totila to spare the man's life, The king listened courteously and calmly to what they had to say, and then, in grave and earnest tones, he expressed his conviction that only so long as the Goths kept themselves pure from injustice could they expect the divine blessing to rest on their cause. He reminded them how brilliant had been the fortunes of the nation under the righteous rule of Theodoric, how, under Theodahad and his successors, the Goths, forsaking the policy of justice and humanity to which they owed their greatness, had brought themselves to the lowest point of humiliation, and how, since they had begun acting in a nobler spirit once again, their prosperity had returned. Would they, he asked, with this experience before them, insist on making the nation an accomplice in this man's guilt? The Gothic chiefs were unable to resist this reasoning, and the criminal underwent his doom. While Totila was behaving in this manner, the Roman generals and their soldiers were plundering the property of those who were subject to their sway, and indulging without restraint in every kind of insolence and excess. We are quoting Procopius, who points out with indignant eloquence the contrast between the, quote, civilized Romans and their, quote, barbarian foe. In Rome itself, the citizens were bitterly regretting their change of masters. Totila knew of the existence of this feeling and resolved to work upon it. First, he sent a letter to the Senate, charging them, if they repented of the crime and folly of their treason against the Goths, to earn their pardon by a voluntary surrender of the city. It is strange that the imperialist commander should have allowed such a letter to be delivered at all. However, he would not permit the Senate to return any answer. A few days passed, and one morning it was found that placards, signed with Totila's name, had been nailed up during the night at all the most frequented parts of the city. They announced that the Goths would shortly march to capture Rome, and contained a solemn declaration that no harm should be done to the citizens. The officers of the imperial army tried in vain to find out who had put up these placards, but it was suspected that it must have been done by the Arian clergy, who were therefore banished from the city. Soon afterwards, the Emperor Justinian received a letter, signed by all his generals in Italy, expressing their opinion that the imperial cause in that country was hopeless, and that the attempt to oppose the victorious progress of the Goths had better be abandoned. End quote. In coming battles, great numbers would desert to Totila, and an incredible series of total victories would follow, with yet another siege of Rome, more starvation due to Roman stubbornness in accepting Totila's terms, until on December 17th, 546 AD, the Goths once again marched through the gates, this time to the site of the imperial army scattering in every direction. One of the first actions of the conquering Goths was to repair the Church of St. Peter, and slowly nurse the starving citizenry back to health. Quote, on the following day, Totila harangued his soldiers on his favorite theme, the importance of justice and mercy, as their only hope of obtaining the blessing of God on their cause. Soon afterwards, he sent Pelagius to Constantinople with other envoys to ask Justinian to agree to terms of peace. Justinian declined to answer, stating the decision of peace or war was in the hands of the general Belisarius, by far Rome's greatest general at this stage, and despite the recent crushing defeats to Totila, their last, best, and only hope. Quote, but we do not find that Totila attempted to open negotiations with Belisarius. Probably he knew too well the iron resolution of his great antagonist to entertain any hope of success. End quote. Justinian's stubbornness both exasperated and angered Totila, finally pushing past his red line. Quote, he determined to take his revenge on Rome, to burn down its magnificent buildings, and to, quote, turn the city into a sheep pasture. Perhaps he really would have disgraced his glorious career by this barbarous deed. But when Belisarius heard of this intention, he sent a letter to the Gothic king, asking him this pointed question: do you choose to appear in history branded as the destroyer of the noblest city in the world, or honored as its preserver? The messengers who bore the letter reported that Totila read it over many times, as if he was learning it by heart. After deep consideration, he returned to Belisarius the assurance that Rome should be spared. The incident is honorable alike to each of the two men. Now that the long siege was over, Totila was able to turn his attention to other parts of his kingdom, which had been suffering the ravages of the imperial armies. He came to the strange resolve of abandoning Rome altogether, destroying a large part of the walls so that it could no longer be available to the enemy as a fortress. He caused the senators to accompany him on his march, and sent the scanty remnants of the citizens, with their wives and children, away to Campania. Many strange things have happened in the history of Rome, but surely one of the strangest of all is that this vast city, with all its noble buildings still uninjured, could have remained for many weeks without any inhabitants." End quote. Amusingly, Belisarius was to slip right back into Rome and hastily rebuild its defenses. The Goths would be back to take it yet again shortly after. As they did so, quote, "There was, however, one brave officer amongst the besieged, Paul of Cilicia, who with 400 men took refuge in the fortress tomb of Hadrian, and prepared it to hold against all attacks. But the Goths were wiser than to attempt an assault. They closely surrounded the fortress and remained quiet, waiting for hunger to do its work. At length, the brave 400 found that they could hold out no longer, and resolved to sally forth in one desperate charge against the foe. Feeling that they were about to rush upon certain destruction, they embraced each other and, quote, kissed each other with the kiss of those doomed to death. And then they issued from the gate of the castle, expecting to perish, but determined to sell their lives as dearly as they could. Before, however, they reached the Gothic lines, they were met by a flag of truce, bringing the unlooked-for offer from the Gothic king that he would either send them unhurt to Constantinople on condition of laying down their arms and giving promise never more to fight against the Goths, or, if they chose, he would accept them as soldiers in his own army, on an equal footing with his own countrymen. Brave men as they were, life was sweet, and they hailed with joy the sudden deliverance. At first they asked to be sent to Constantinople, but when they thought of the cold reception they would meet with there, and the dangers of the journey to unarmed men, they came to the conclusion that Totila was a better master to serve than Justinian, and so they agreed to be enrolled in the Gothic ranks. There were also 400 other soldiers who, instead of escaping from the city, had taken refuge in the churches, and these too joined themselves to Totila's army." End quote. Even still, due to the shrewd planning of Justinian, the massive wealth of the Eastern Roman Empire now devoted to the singular cause of Gothic destruction, the tide would now begin to turn. Having learned his lesson about testing his own armies against Gothic military prowess, Justinian now set out to lavishly bribe every stray Goth, and especially herald, that he found willing. Now at Ravenna, Totila found himself staring down a vast army containing many mercenaries of his own kin, with the finest weaponry and armor money could buy. It's said that the Goths were terribly downcast at this sight, and all of Totila's eloquence was needed to keep them from despair. "Fellow soldiers," he said, "this is our last struggle. If we win this battle, Justinian's power is crushed and our freedom is secure. Show yourselves men this day, for tomorrow it will be too late. Spare neither your horses nor your arms, for whether victors or vanquished, you will never need them more. Remember that there is no safety for you but in victory. To flee is to seek destruction. Let not the multitude of the enemy dismay you. We are a nation fighting for our freedom, for our country, for all that makes life precious. They are a hireling band of Huns and Heruls, and people of all races and tongues, divided by ancient hatreds and bound together for no other common interest but their pay." End quote. It's said that, quote, Totila rode in front of the Gothic lines, clothed in golden armor and purple robes, and displayed his skill in horsemanship, galloping round in circles, throwing up his spear and catching it as he rode, and other such feats. End quote. Though I suspect that even he knew that this was likely the end of the line, and merely sought to end the chapter with his characteristic courage and leadership. Being vastly outnumbered by the best men and equipment Rome could muster, their luck had finally run out. After the brutal fight was over, the king of the Goths was making his escape from the battlefield, accompanied by 2 or 3 of his faithful friends, when Aspad, the chief of the Gepids, rushed at him with his lance, not knowing in the darkness who he was. One of the Goths indignantly exclaimed, "Dog, would you kill your own master?" Aspad knew then whom he was attacking, and thrust at Totila with all his strength, but himself fell wounded immediately after. The Goths carried their master as far as Caprae, a village 7 miles away, where he shortly afterwards breathed his last. After the disaster of Tadino, the remnant of the Gothic army retired into northern Italy, and there Tea was chosen king of the Goths. Having been betrayed and now finding themselves starving, sending away their horses, they suddenly rushed on foot upon the astonished Romans. The battle that ensued was terrible. Not one of Homer's heroes, says Procopius, ever performed greater miracles of valor than did Tea on that day. After fighting for many hours in front of his army, he called to the armor-bearer to change his shield, which was heavy with the weight of 12 broken spears. Left for a moment unprotected, he was pierced in the breast by a spear. So fell the last Gothic king of Italy. The Romans cut off his head and displayed it on a pole to encourage their own soldiers and to dismay their enemies. But even the loss of their king was ineffectual to abate the desperate fury of the Goths. They fought on until the fall of night, and at daybreak they renewed the struggle, which continued till darkness again compelled them to pause. On the third morning, worn out with fatigue and hunger, they felt that it was impossible for them to fight any longer. Their leaders sent ambassadors to Narses to treat for peace. But even then, they would not humble themselves to become the subjects of Justinian. All they would promise was that they would never again bear arms against the empire, and this only on condition of being allowed an unmolested passage out of Italy, and of receiving money for expenses for their journey. The Roman generals held a council to discuss this proposal. They had had such terrible experience of the desperate valor of the Goths that they decided to accept the conditions. Consider for a moment just how incredible this situation was. A greatly outnumbered, defeated, kingless, and war-weary people, short on supplies and with inferior equipment, still refusing to bend the knee to the Eastern Emperor, and in fact making demands that were subsequently agreed to. This was the power of Gothic prestige and reputation. The Roman generals knew full well that the Goths would fight to the last man if need be, and the resulting slaughter would be terrible. Regardless, with the help of the brilliant generalship of Belisarius, Justinian had won the day. The Ostrogoths were defeated. Thus we now move west to the Visigoths and Spain. Sisebut marks one of the last Gothic leaders worthy of the name, and one of the last to hold to the Gothic law that their leader be descended from pure Gothic blood. He was reputed to be a scholar, a brilliant general, magnanimous and just, and one who labored actively for the betterment of his people. Quote, Sisebut, who was chosen king in 612, was a man about whom we would be glad to know more. He was a successful general, and his victories compelled the Greeks to surrender nearly all of their possessions in Spain. Like the Gothic heroes of older days, Theodoric and Totila, he was distinguished for humanity towards the conquered. Many of the Greek prisoners had been sold into slavery by their Gothic captors, and the king purchased their freedom at his own cost. He was also a scholar, and a generous patron of such learning as existed in the Spain of his day. Unhappily, it has to be added that he was the first Gothic king who ever persecuted the Jews. End quote. There's a stray line in Isidore's historical account that hints Sisebut may have met a similar fate to so many other Gothic leaders and nobles during this time period. Quote, some claim that he died a natural death, others that he died as a result of an overdose of some medication. End quote. Men who formerly lived to very ripe old ages now began dying in the prime of their lives. And not just kings and leaders, but several of their sons and daughters of the royal line as well. It was in this era that the marketplace gained in prominence and importance, and with it, the practice of usury. Banned by all Christian peoples as the greatest of evils, but practiced with enthusiasm by others. This, inevitably, helped kickstart the amassing of great fortunes in short order. With regards to the Jewish population in their midst, Gothic leaders from Theodoric forward had attempted several seemingly desperate means and methods of integrating them, from mandatory conversions for those who wished to remain in Gothic lands, to passing laws against various, quote, heresies meant to encourage their exit. Unwilling to part with their prosperous conditions, these only had the effect of pushing Jewish religion and culture underground, And although many were to technically convert to Gothic Christianity, to retain their homes and positions and wealth, the naive Gothic aristocracy failed to comprehend that a people might be willing to do this in a purely utilitarian and surface-level manner, maintaining a public front for appearances, but as Bradley put it, continuing in the secrecy of their homes to practice Jewish ritual and to teach their children to curse the Goths. It was as if they couldn't fathom that a people might be lying in this highest and most important of all issues, and this was to be a cultural difference that would cost them dearly. Amidst all of the scheming and court intrigue, something mysterious occurs, something not fully understood or explained to this very day. In October of 680, the Gothic king Wamba, likely the very last king of pure Gothic descent, and a man so unwilling to take the crown that he had to be forced at sword point by his dukes, was found unconscious in the palace. Strangely, steps were taken to immediately dress him in monk's robes, which thereby legally disqualified him from holding the kingship any longer, based on a recently written obscure rule. Perhaps to the dismay of those around him, Wamba recovered, and in fact, many believe he'd been poisoned. But any protests on his part would have been in vain. A disreputable scoundrel, the first of many, was lifted up in his place by a Julian of Toledo, whom many believe to be the new king's handler of sorts. A man by the name of Ervig, this new leader was Gothic only on his mother's side by adoption, a flagrant disregard of ancient Gothic law. And thus, as Ervig immediately set about reversing all of the thoughtful improvements instituted by Wamba, everything now began to unravel in earnest. Beset on all sides by Roman Catholic, Jewish, and Saracen interests beginning to jockey for land, power, and wealth, the Goths' battles would now largely be fought on unfamiliar and uncomfortable terrain, namely the halls and recesses of palaces and courts and city streets, via that more modern sort of manipulation and political maneuvering that's become so popular in our own day. The tension with the Jews, especially, began to spiral out of control. The historian Henry Bradley states, quote, "In the year 694, the government was thrown into the wildest panic by the discovery of another plot, in which nearly all of the Jews of the kingdom were supposed to have been concerned." End quote. A plot seemingly aimed at overthrowing Gothic leadership by any means necessary. At the council in Toledo of that year, it's recorded that, quote, "The Jews had opposed Christian rulers in various parts of the world, killing some and setting up Jewish rulers who acted against Christians." End quote. Exposing the plot was hardly a victory, as little changed afterwards. Several Jews fled to North Africa, but most remained, and the mutual animosity had only grown, if anything. Ervig was succeeded by his son Egica, another violation of Gothic traditions, and even more disreputable than his father, and finally Egica was followed by his son, Witiza, who was to epitomize the corruption and degeneracy of his age, and act as possibly the most destructive single figure in Gothic history. Immediately upon taking power, he had nearly all of his enemies killed, blinded, or imprisoned, and, quote, "At last feeling safe, the king gave reins to his licentious passions, and soon, by his tyranny and sensuality, acquired the appellation of Witiza the Wicked." Hailed by many historians as a great friend to the Jews, it seems the peers of his day would have agreed, but wouldn't have voiced this in a complimentary way. Several accounts go so far as to speak of Witiza as essentially serving the Jewish powers in his realm, in the manner of a submissive vassal, such as the Chronicle of Lucas of Tuy. But I've had to rely on excerpts and surviving second-hand accounts of this work, as I've been unable to find any surviving English translation, something I find strange considering it was widely quoted throughout the 18 and 1900s. Witiza encouraged the clergy to marry, breaking ancient tradition, and he himself kept numerous wives and mistresses, and it's even reported that he encouraged his people to do the same. He lived a dissolute life, and the stories range from his aggressively depleting the treasury to going so far as to destroy several fortifications across the land for spurious reasons. He seems to have nearly inverted the power structure, freeing from prison and forgiving the debts of those who were formerly considered the worst, and heaping brutal punishments on many formerly without blemish to their name. Manuel Perez Villamil, member of the Royal Academy of History, tells us in volume 54 of The Catholic World, quote, "In these times, so fraught with peril, Witiza ascended the throne. Not content, as a chronicle expresses it, with provoking the ire of God by his vices, he placed himself in the hands of the Jews, who in a very short time reached a preponderance in Spain greater than ever before. It will suffice to say that the new monarch ordered the canons and laws directed against the Jews during preceding reigns to be repealed, and raised to high positions many descendants of that prescribed race. The Jews, having in short time acquired a really dangerous preponderance, improved to their advantage every opportunity favorable to their purpose which came in their way, and doubtless laying new plans for revenge, prepared themselves secretly to retaliate for the wrongs undergone by them under the Visigothic rule. Chroniclers as truthful and reliable as the great prince Don Alfonso III, John of Baclara, the monk of Silos, and others besides, relate that Witiza leveled to the ground all of the strongholds of the realm, with the exception of 3 only, and ordered all of the weapons of warfare to be burned. Were these measures taken in compliance with malevolent suggestions from his own new counselors? Everything seems to indicate this." End quote. Though I'm not sure I agree with their framing, Wikipedia attempts to paint him as an oblivious bumbler. Quote, "Using secret orders, he demolished castles that he feared could be used by future internal enemies, oblivious to the possibility that he was weakening the kingdom's defenses against foreign invaders. And at court, inspired by the custom of Muslim rulers, he, quote, indulged in a plurality of wives and concubines, encouraging his subjects to do the same." End quote. We still know very little about this man, his origins and his family and his reign. What we do know is that these were the years the Saracen invasions began in earnest, aided greatly, according to nearly every historical account, by the Jewish population in Visigothic Spain, who essentially opened the gates for them, in some cases literally, and provided both strategic intelligence and support. What follows is a series of suspiciously well-timed attacks against Visigothic Spain, and as each town fell, the Muslim invaders would transfer the city to the local Jewish element, which allowed the army to march onward with their entire force to repeat the process, as opposed to garrisoning their own troops. Volume 54 of The Catholic World goes on to state, quote, "That the Jews took part in these events may have been inferred from our narrative so far, but we will add that during the short time the rebellion lasted, Gothic Gaul was overrun by Jews who, casting aside their dissimulation, declared themselves openly in favor of the rebels, going to the length of joining them in taking up arms, which shows that they founded hopes on the success of the conspiracy." End quote. In fact, even the Arab chroniclers attest that strong fortresses and important cities, in which the Jewish race was prominent by numbers and wealth, and which undoubtedly would have cost Tarik's forces a great expenditure of blood to get possession of, were surrendered to him by the Jews, to whom they were afterwards given in charge to guard and who fraternized with the African invaders. But the clearest evidence of perfidy and conspiracy appears in the capture of Toledo, which Vamba had fortified with towers, and which from its strong position was impregnable. Let us look up the records of the renowned chronicler Queen Berenguela, Bishop Don Lucas of Tuy. He relates that in the year 715, the Visigothic capital, Toledo, having been invested by the Arab commander Tariq bin Zayad, the Christian inhabitants of the city went out on Palm Sunday to the near-at-hand Basilica of Saint Leocadia to celebrate therein the Passion of our Lord. The Jews, taking advantage of their absence, delivered over the seat of government of Leovigildo and Ricaredo to the besiegers, the Christians having been massacred partly in the plain and partly in the basilica itself. All the historians of Toledo, inclusive of the venerable Archbishop Don Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada, in his Latin and Spanish chronicles, agree in this statement of facts. In view of these facts, writes Amador de los Rios, there can be no doubt that there existed between these two peoples, the Arab and the Jewish, a certain kind of combination and concerted action, which seems to proceed from secret sympathies and understandings, if not from former pacts and alliances. We allow ourselves, relying on what the old chroniclers tell, having gone more deeply into the study of this historical question, to affirm that the Jews, and they only, attracted the Arab hosts to Spain." End quote. And in fact, Harold Livermore, in The Twilight of the Goths, seems to indicate that Muhammad himself was essentially seen as Jewish by many in the West at the time, with theologians not knowing what to make of Islam in these earliest stages. Finally, the Jewish Encyclopedia also states, quote, "It remains a fact that the Jews, either directly or through their co-religionists in Africa, encouraged the Mohammedans to conquer Spain, and that they greeted them as their deliverers. After the Battle of Jerez, in which African Jews fought bravely under Kala al-Yahidi, and in which the last Gothic king, Rodrigo, and his nobles were slain, the conquerors Musa and Tariq were everywhere victorious. The conquered cities Cordova, Malaga, Granada, Seville, and Toledo were placed in the charge of the Jewish inhabitants, who had been armed by the Arabs." End quote. Although modern historians are currently working overtime to portray this period as a rebirth, and the so-called Andalusian Empire as a bastion of tolerance and learning and enlightenment, those who lived through the period, especially the transition, seem to tell a polar opposite story. A great example of this being the compelling work by Dario Fernandez Morora called The Myth of Andalusian Paradise. The stories of this carnage and atrocity are almost unbelievable, and the majority of such tales have certainly been lost forever. Dario Fernandez tells us, quote, "Shortly after the Islamic forces landed, the flesh of some of the Christians killed in battle was boiled in large cauldrons under the sight of terrified Christian prisoners, who became convinced that the Muslims were cannibals. And then, quote, in a furious assault, the remaining Christian defenders retreated to a church to continue fighting. According to al-Makari, the Muslims put the building to the torch, and the Christians inside died without surrendering, and those that did surrender were beheaded." End quote. For Roman, Greek, and Goth, the holy places were sites of refuge, respected even in times of brutal war. Such actions would have been jarring. Having recently burned the Library of Alexandria in 642, and even made an attempt to destroy the pyramids, the Muslim armies that rampaged through Europe seemed especially eager to destroy churches, loot all valuable treasures, and kidnap massive numbers of females for sexual slavery, renaming towns and monuments and roads as they went. They promptly destroyed a Gothic bridge, one of the finest in all of Europe, and tore down a gigantic bronze statue in Cadiz, thinking it was made of gold. And it was in this same period that the famed Colossus was procured by a Jewish Syrian trader and promptly melted down for scrap metal. The historical work, the Chronicle of 754, speaks powerfully of the fall of Spain. Quote, "Who can relate such perils? Who can enumerate such grievous disasters? Even if every limb were transformed into a tongue, it would be beyond human capability to express the ruin of Spain and its many and great evils." End quote. The fleeing Visigothic nobles, unable to travel quickly with their immense treasures of accrued generational wealth, lost virtually everything, and had to hastily bury much of the rest. Quote, "We have magnificent Visigothic religious treasures found buried along the routes leading from southern Spain to the north," Dario Fernandez's book tells us. And Arabs were to come across stashes of emeralds and rubies, quote, "in such abundance as no man had seen before, and were stunned." The Jews also saw a swift rise in their economic state, being now able to revitalize and monopolize their trade in silk and slaves, and no doubt receiving their share of the treasures of their former rulers and neighbors. The sons of Witiza, who are otherwise unknown, are made out by the Chronicle of Alfonso III to be traitors who helped deliver Hispania to the Moors, a fact which seems to remove any lingering historical doubt as to whether Witiza himself was an honest actor. The last bastion of Gothic power had been subverted and destroyed. It was as if all the world had conspired against them in a cruel twist of fate, most of the facts of which had gone unspoken to this very day, being stripped of their defenses and weaponry by their own corrupt ruler, subsequently stripped of scepter, throne, and treasure, and now stripped of their lands. A man named Pelagius, and many nobles, held out in a series of heroic battles in the mountains of the Asturias, a movement that would plant the seeds that would later grow into the famed Reconquista, as Christians fought to regain their homeland. Henry Bradley tells us, quote, "The Christians of the Asturias maintained their independence under a succession of Gothic chiefs, to whom the later kings of Spain were proud to trace their ancestry. In all the uprisings of the Christians against the Moors, and in the last great struggle, which ended in the overthrow of the infidel rule, men with Gothic names appear as leaders and champions. But for the Gothic element in the Spanish people, the chivalry of Castile would never have been, and Spain might even yet have remained under Mohammedan rule. To this day, the noble families of Spain boast, if not always with reason, of the purity of their Gothic blood." End quote. In fact, the surnames Gomez, Fernandez, Gonzalez, Rodriguez, and several others all harken back directly to the Gothic root. And of course, though their royal lines were fractured and their name and empire destroyed, the Goths themselves lived on, leaving a significant genetic and cultural imprint all throughout the West, including in Italy, France, and Spain. Yet, in another strange twist of fate, a far-flung, isolated, and forgotten remnant of Gothic culture may have remained largely untouched up until very recently. Henry Bradley continues, quote, "For the last traces of the Goths as a separate people, speaking their own language, we must, however, look not to Spain, but far away to the east of Europe. At the end of the 4th century, when the empire of Ermanaric fell under the yoke of the Huns, a small remnant of the Ostrogoths found shelter from the savage invaders in the Crimea, and in this remote corner of Europe they preserved their existence as a nation for more than 1,000 years. Early in the 5th century, they were converted to Catholic Christianity, and their bishops long continued to take part in the general councils of the Church. In the year 1562, a traveler from Belgium named Busbeck met with 2 ambassadors sent by this little nation to Constantinople, and wrote down a long list of words belonging to their language. Of course, many of these words were greatly corrupted, and some of them are not Gothic at all, but borrowed from the languages of surrounding nations. But still, the list makes it quite clear that the language spoken by this Crimean people must originally have been the same with that used by Wulfila in his translation of the Bible. Nearly 200 years later, about 1750, a charitable Jesuit of Vienna, named Mondorf, ransomed a prisoner from the Turkish galleys and learned from him that he came from the Crimea, and that his native language bore some resemblance to German. It is possible that Mondorf was not mistaken, and, strange as it seems to think of it, that the language of Wulfila was actually surviving in some corrupted shape, only a century and a half ago. Mondorf's ransomed captive knew nothing about Christianity, but said that his countrymen worshipped an ancient tree. Until the 18th century, the Crimea was still called Gothia. End quote. Towards the end of the era of Gothic dominance, though besieged on all sides by varied, though likely conspiring, foes, they still displayed a courage and magnanimous nature which remains exceptional throughout history. One of the last Gothic leaders was Sigebut's son, Recared. Isidore tells us of his crushing victory scored against an invading army of Franks, 60,000 strong, and how the Goths pursued the fleeing army back to and then into their own kingdom, calling it one of the greatest Visigothic victories in history. And then tells us this, which I believe well summarizes the ancient Germanic conception of warfare. Quote, "Recared often pitted his strength against the excesses of the Romans and the attacks of the Basques. In these cases, he seemed not so much to be waging wars as to be exercising his people to keep them fit, as one would do in the sport of wrestling." End quote. He goes on to speak of Recared's personal character. Quote, "The provinces which his father conquered in war, Recared preserved in peace, administered with equity, and ruled with moderation. He was kind and mild, of remarkable goodness. He had such a graceful demeanor and so benevolent a heart, that, influencing the minds of everyone, he led even bad men to desire his love. He restored misappropriated wealth, reduced the tribute required by his people, and enriched and elevated many with gifts and honors, and was famous for the innate quality of his virtue." End quote. And it's this same Isidore of Seville I'd like to cite as a historical postscript, before my own subjective postscript. Speaking of the Goths, he tells us, quote, The meaning of their name in our language is tectum, by which is meant strength, and rightly so, for there was never a people on earth that succeeded in exhausting the Roman Empire to such an extent. These were the ones that Alexander himself declared should be avoided, the ones that Pyrrhus feared, the ones that made Caesar shudder. They have been proved to have a common origin with the Scythians. That is why they are not much different in name. With one letter changed and one removed, Getae becomes Scythae. They were inhabitants of the icy peaks of the west, and they lived on the mountain slopes with other peoples. Driven from their territory by the attacks of the Huns, they crossed the Danube and surrendered themselves to the Romans. But when they could no longer tolerate their unjust treatment, they took up arms in their wrath, invaded Thrace, devastated Italy, besieged and captured Rome, entered Gaul, and bursting through the Pyrenees, reached Spain, where they established their homeland and dominion. The Goths are agile by nature and quick to understand. They have a strong sense of duty. Robust in bodily strength and lofty in stature, they are impressive in their carriage and demeanor. Skillful with their hands, they are also impervious to wounds. Just as the poet says about them, the Getae despise death while praising the wound. They waged such great wars and had such a reputation for glorious victory that Rome itself, the conqueror of all peoples, submitted to the yoke of captivity and yielded to the Gothic triumphs. The mistress of all nations served them like a handmaid. All of the peoples of Europe feared them. The barriers of the Alps gave way before them. The Vandals, widely known for their own barbarity, were not so much terrified by the presence of the Goths as put to flight by their renown. The Alans were extinguished by the strength of the Goths. The Suevi, too, forced into inaccessible corners of Spain, have now experienced the threat of extermination at the hands of the Goths. The kingdom which they had held in idle lethargy, they now have lost at a shameful cost. It seems quite amazing how they managed to retain up to the present day that which they have now given up without any show of resistance. But who could express the great strength of the Getic people? Since the right to rule is rarely granted to peoples who choose to rely on entreaties and gifts, the Goths opted to secure their liberty in battle rather than through negotiations. For whenever the need to fight presents itself, the Goths always prefer to go to battle than to resort to treaties. In the arts of war, they are quite spectacular, fighting on horseback not only with spears but with javelins. Though they enter the battle on horseback as well as on foot, they trust more in the swift running of their horses. As the poet says, where the Getan goes, he goes with his horse. They love to exercise themselves with weapons and compete in battle. They hold contests in sport every day. Until recently, they lacked experience in only one aspect of fighting. They had no desire to wage naval battles. But ever since King Sisebut took up the royal scepter, they have made such great and successful progress that they now go forth with their forces on sea as well as land. Subjected, the Roman soldier now serves the Goths, whom he sees as being served by many peoples and by Spain itself." End quote. And this Gothic prestige was to continue long after their fall. There's an anecdote regarding the Roman Catholic Ecclesiastical Conference in Basel in 1434, where representatives from several nations, including Sweden and Spain, argued for more influence due to their ancestral connections to the Gothic race. The Swedish representative, Nicholas Ragvaldi, argued that Sweden was the original homeland of the Goths, while the Spanish representative countered that the Spanish Goths more perfectly demonstrated the adventurous Gothic spirit of courage by migrating away from their homeland. To give a brief summary of what many historical accounts seem to suggest, it seems that the Romans, Franks, and Goths all sprung from the same root. Though the Goths may have well been the royal Scythians, residing north of the Black Sea, an element that remained aloof in most of the more minor military squabbles, and taking up arms only when the natural order was seriously threatened, the Chronicle of Fredegar and the Liber Historiae Francorum, and the several works both of these documents cite, suggest that both the Romans and Franks were descended from the same group of survivors from Troy. The Chronicle describes Priam as a Frankish king whose people migrated to Macedonia after the fall of Troy. In Macedonia, the Franks then divided. The European Franks reached Francia under King Franccio, just as Romulus went to Rome. Fredegar stated that Theudemir, named king of the Franks by Gregory, was descended from Priam, Frigga, and Franccio. Another work, the Gesta, described how 12,000 Trojans, led by Priam and Antenor, sailed from Troy to the river Don in Russia and on to Pannonia, which is on the river Danube, settling near the Sea of Azov, where they founded a city called Sicambria. This Frankish-Roman connection might well explain how late Rome was able to bribe, threaten, or cajole so many Frankish leaders into turning their energy against the incoming Gothic element. And this is speculative, but it seems as if the Heruli, later to become our Jarls and Earls in Europe, may have been equivalent to aristocratic adventurers and mercenaries, often used as the tip of the spear to clear the way for larger migrations. It's easy to imagine how these may have morphed into the Vikings of later eras. Extremely proficient warriors, keen on finding adventure and battle wherever the opportunity might arise, even, in exceptional occasions, for Rome against their kin. We know they were in high demand in Rome, and in several other nations over a long stretch of time, to be used as the royal bodyguard, or elite military units, and made up the legendary Varangian Guard, which famously caused the general Phocas to fall dead of a stroke in full view of both armies at the mere sight of their approach. It's incredible how little attention this element receives from modern academics. As Dr. Lasquino from the University of Aberdeen puts it, in expressing her surprise at how little is known at this portion of history, quote, "There are written accounts of Viking raids in northern Spain, but archaeologically, absolutely nothing has been done on an academic scale," end quote. A subject academics seem much happier to focus on, and much more keen to paint in a positive light relative to the surviving first-hand accounts, is Justinian. Justinian was described after his death, by many who knew him best, in an extremely negative light. Cruel, duplicitous, unjust, fickle, and Procopius goes so far as to label him outright satanic in nature. He raised taxes to unbearable levels, and seemed to care little, if at all, for the suffering of his people, as he indulged in vast building projects they neither wanted nor had the money or manpower to justify. It's said he was irresistibly attracted to every form of newness and novelty, which calls to mind modern political and ideological forces that use progress as a cover for the destruction of everything traditional and time-tested. Nowhere is the contrast between degenerating Rome and the Goths more on display than in the difference in the character between this man and Theodoric, who once stated, quote, "Reverently to preserve the old is even better than building afresh." The Gothic leaders seemed to recognize some internal element that made Rome great, and sought earnestly to preserve this. Justinian, assuming he cared at all, seems to have believed that Rome was great due to her external trappings, building projects, and public displays. One of the great strengths of the Gothic tradition was their calm, settled, and set-in-stone manner of doing things, not subject to temporary cultural whims. Even as they picked up and moved west in their vast wagon trains, reminiscent of the later spread westward by pioneers throughout North America, they all the while preserved themselves as a very distinct and unchanging nation. It's my belief that the Goths, whether consciously or unconsciously, recognized something of immense importance. A nation, at its best, is essentially an extension of the family unit. They weren't to be built around a marketplace, or have their worth or health measured by ridiculous economic metrics. Nor was it the buildings, roads, and aqueducts, or even the arts or various aspects of culture that acted as the foundation. The core of any lasting nation was to be something within, not without, and something infinitely more valuable. The Gothic and Germanic conception of justice, of nobility, of dignity and worth, and a conception of life that had meaning and substance, this was the flame with the power of lighting countless future fires. With this as the bedrock, Healthy societies might be created at any time as they moved and migrated and conquered, naturally and easily, as if second nature. It's this combination of energy and will, coupled with the orderliness of magnanimous justice and nobility of spirit, that cultivates and prepares the fertile ground from which greatness can spring. It also gave them unshakable confidence on and off the battlefield, caused opposing armies to defect to their ranks, and produced a sterling reputation across friends and foes alike. When a nation is thought of as an extended family and each member seeks to give his best to all others and in return receive their best, this is a perfect example of harnessed and channeled energy, a building energy, as opposed to the wildly wasteful dissipation of energies we experience today, as we feel so atomized and disconnected, and as we watch our physical and mental and spiritual energy being directed towards individuals or corporate entities or ideas with which we feel no connection or resonance. This isn't just a dissipation of energy, it's a lessening of energies, both felt and expressed, across the board. But there's more. Because the body and mind adapt to all that one thinks and does throughout the day, imagine the heightened senses and health of an ancient Goth or Scythian or Spartan or Viking. It's often been said, what worries you masters you, or what you fear masters you. These men made a sport out of so much our modern age has decided to fear, banished the morbid nature of death with a Valhalla-esque religious ethos, came to know and master their land and environment, ate the best and freshest foods, worked out and sported all day. The psychological effects, the most important of all. Fearless, strong, up to facing any obstacle and knowing this to be the case, and welcoming any challenge, actively seeking out tests of strength. The noble culture they sought to create had no place for bitterness, envy, or smallness. Immersed in nature and God's creation, and using this as their template and guide. I believe all of this caused their mind, body, and soul to be wired differently from modern man's, from their first moments onward. More than once, they picked up everything and moved as an entire nation into the unknown, and met with every challenge along the way. There was no horizon they feared. They knew how to hunt, fish, grow food, raise and breed cattle and horses, set up temporary or permanent housing virtually anywhere at any time, or even live in their wagons for stretches when the situation demanded it. It's difficult to imagine a scenario they wouldn't have felt equal to. And yet, a genuine modesty pervades their words and their history of actions. If alive today and offered an urban existence and every creature comfort known to man, in exchange for being severed from a life amongst kin and familiar culture, divorced from the multitude of skill sets and broad knowledge base on how to live comfortably in virtually any location or situation in the natural world, knowing they'd be made softer and weaker and more dependent by the day, and atop it all, having to perform work duties for which they'd likely feel no passion or deep gratification. Does anyone expect they would take this trade? I remind everyone once again that the Gothic forces were masters of an intact Rome on several occasions, complete with all of its bread and circuses and conveniences, and consciously chose to maintain their way of life, time and time again, seemingly without a second thought. And when finally settling for a period in and around Rome, maintained their own system of justice, their own culture and traditions, passed laws preventing intermarriage, and eagerly sought out the sporting exercise of justified war or adventure. It seems that from their perspective, Rome, towards its end, having been stripped of its natural energy and everything that had once made her great, was more of a stagnant swamp than that conception modern historians increasingly push of an all-powerful multicultural marketplace from which everything civilized sprung. The Germanic element, epitomized by the Goths, weren't ignorant and disheveled barbaric savages, bent on rape and plunder and destruction, but rather the polar opposite. They seemed to seek a restoration of the old order. And based on every first-hand account, Theodoric really did manage to usher in something of a paradise on Earth, before corruption and intrigue and chaos managed to claw its way back and win the day. I can't help but think these Goths knew the cost of allowing themselves to become ensnared and dependent on the slew of artificial constructs we've come to know as the state, that slowly but surely comes to dominate mankind the moment he ceases to be vigilant. When you forget how to fight, broadly speaking, you come to forget what courage is and why it's important. When you forget how to feed, clothe, and house your family, you forget what personal responsibility and self-sufficiency means. And when you rely on all things to be granted to you from outside sources, you finally forget what it means to be a man. Our age has been divested of this health, and I've come to believe this is largely by design. A capable and self-sufficient man who's worked to master his fears is truly sovereign, truly free. Make demands of him, and they'll likely fall on deaf ears. You can't offer him much, nor can you take much. His opposite type, however, is thrown into chaos at the slightest hiccup in his dependent and domesticated existence. I've been accused once or twice of glorifying the past, and to this I'd respond that yes, that's precisely what I'm doing. According to the most real and meaningful metrics, I can't help but believe we've taken 2 steps backwards to every 1 step forward, in countless ways. I'm reminded of the J.G. Farrell quote, "We look on past ages with condescension as a mere preparation for us. But what if we are a mere afterglow of them?" End quote. And this might well be paired with the maxim, "An age in which nothing is worth dying for is an age in which nothing is worth living for." Existence is being stripped of depth and meaning, and a tawdry cheapness and pettiness is everywhere offered up in its place. In place of beautiful and ornate architecture, we now build clunky, modernist monstrosities. Instead of goods made by local master craftsmen, each unique and brimming with character and life, we have cheaply made plastic toys from China. The romantic courtship process largely replaced with pornography and Tinder. The governance of leaders that care for their people replaced with the worst form of mob rule, in which an indoctrinated public can be driven to enthusiastically support their own demise because a corrupt press is their only informational source, and our sense of community utterly destroyed and replaced with the most toxic and unhealthy virtual environments, in which only the most arrogant and ignorant and shameless voices are magnified. In 1941, as the Nazis occupied France, after 1,200 long years, the Visigothic treasure was finally restored by Heinrich Himmler to General Franco in Spain, and to this day it remains in the Archaeological Museum and the Royal Palace in Madrid, all except the famed Squintilla crown, which had been stolen in 1921, and the whereabouts of which remain a mystery. And there's been another deeply intriguing recent development, which I think so well illustrates the broader storyline of this entire series, that I'd like to close our focus on the Goths with its mention. Justinian and Theodora, with their divide and conquer political games, their conspiracies and corruption, their secret underground dungeons in which they covertly disposed of their foes, not only sought to blot out the royal line of the Goths and remove them from power by any means necessary, but just as eagerly sought to erase them from history, a pattern we seem to see carried on up to the present day. But, as if by divine providence, despite their best efforts, some traces still remain.
But the biggest secret of these early Dark Ages lies with a people who didn't destroy a city and who weren't nomadic warriors. A people who conquered and then settled. They lived just like the Romans and left behind a glorious legacy, one which remained deliberately hidden for nearly 1,500 years. Here in Ravenna, the Goths took over the last capital of the Western Roman Empire. For 33 years under their king, Theodoric, it was the equal of any Roman capital. Theodoric renovated and reformed its institutions, improved and enhanced its splendor, and in a few short years created one of the wonders of the age. This would have been like walking through heaven's gates. If this had been an age of darkness, then here, without doubt, was a cathedral of light. This is Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, built by Theodoric nearly 1500 years ago, one of the brightest jewels of the Dark Ages.
I'd like you to look at the mosaics from this position. You can see that the background is shining, is reflecting the light from the windows because it was made of glass cubes and gold cubes, and the robes of the saints are dull, are opaque, because they were made using marble cubes, so as to give the impression of wool, of textiles.
These works were commissioned by Theodoric, the Gothic king. Yet most visitors today think they are Roman or Byzantine mosaics. Why should that be? Is it because we have all been conditioned to assume that work of this quality must be Roman? Perhaps there are other reasons. As I looked more closely, I began to wonder, why are there so many mosaic curtains in a scene of such splendor? And what do these hands, unattached to any bodies, signify? In Sant'Apollinare, I wanted to see whether the mystery of the curtains was any clearer. I realize now that they reflect so much work that they must have had a very deliberate purpose. What were they supposed to represent?
This part of the mosaic that shows you the royal palace, all this mosaic was made and commissioned by Theodoric. This mosaic has been changed, altered. We could say that it has been vandalized by the Byzantines because some images have been destroyed. Those images that had portrayed Theodoric, members of his court, members of his clergy, and that stood between the columns, now they have been replaced with curtains. But you can still see the hands here. There is one hand here, another one here, another one here, and another hand here, and another hand here. And you can still see the halos here of the heads that have disappeared. All these elements tell us that previous images have been destroyed. It was an act of censorship, we could say.
Echoes from the past, reminders of what once was, and perhaps hints of a more exceptional state of being that might one day be revived. To a Justinian, the modern world may appear as the crowning glory of the human journey. To a Theodoric, a man who prized quality over quantity, who moved slowly but surely, who knew the importance of reverence for everything of immense value at our root, it may seem as if we've lost the plot and are in danger of losing everything. Speaking personally, I very much agree with this. The type of justice and order and nobility so well represented by the best of the Gothic element marked a high point in our history, to such an extent that a true understanding might just help provide us a roadmap to those very same peaks. Ideally, not to settle and rest on our laurels, but to strive ever higher. not from a petty pride or any desire for ego gratification, but from a natural, intuitive inclination, and for a purpose higher than ourselves.